Today's demonstration is how to make the dough for pan de muerto, which is the bread that is used for Day of the Dead celebration in Mexico and other Hispanic communities throughout the world. This is a pan dulce, a sweet bread that is a yeast bread. So when working with yeast, some things that we have to keep in mind about yeast and what they need is three things to make them grow. They need warmth, they need moisture, and they need sugar to feed on. And when they have those three things in place, then they will grow and produce carbon dioxide, which leads to bread rising. They also produce alcohol as a byproduct, which is how fermentation is done for making beer and wine and other adult beverages. But the alcohol that's produced during the fermentation of bread is going to evaporate in the oven. Alcohol evaporates about 170 Fahrenheit. We'll be baking off much, much higher than that. But because of the fermentation, we do need to take care of our dough and not let it be in the fridge too long, or we're going to get kind of a strange taste to it. All right, a quick overview of equipment and some ingredients before we start. We're going to be using our KitchenAid mixer. You can use a flat beater, but the dough hook would certainly be something easier when you have a ball of dough to take off. We have eggs that get added in, make this a rich dough. We are going to have a saucepan that we have to use to heat up the items for our sponge. More about that in a moment. For our sponge, we're going to be needing 4 tablespoons of butter, which is half a stick, and to make this very rich. We have a 1/4 cup of water and a 1/4 cup of milk, adds up to a 1/2 cup total. We have a thermometer in place that needs to check the temperature of this liquid. The yeast wants to be between 105 and 115 in that moist environment. And we need to use a thermometer to make sure we're not too hot. If the liquid is too hot, it's going to kill your yeast and then it won't grow. And if the liquid's not warm enough, the yeast won't be growing at all. They'll just be stagnant. For flavoring, we have a 1/4 cup of sugar, which is going to make it sweet. We have some traditional aniseed, which is going to be like a black licorice flavor. I want you guys to have a chance to taste this dough ahead of time to decide whether or not you're going to be using all of that ingredient or none. There is some salt for flavoring. 2 cups of flour for the early part of the recipe. And then eventually we have another 3/4 a cup of flour. So 2 3/4 cup of flour total. But this gets added in later on as the dough is formed. If we put all the flour in at once, it won't probably come together. So we have to add it gradually. We want a thermometer that takes an accurate temperature so we can check the temperature of our sponge. Okay, the recipe says that with the butter, we want to try to plan ahead to make sure that this is softened. This is still a little bit too hard, didn't plan ahead enough. The problem is that when this butter gets melted, if it's coming straight out of the fridge and rock hard, by the time it melts, it's going to be so hot that your sponge will be overly hot, and then you will need to wait a while for it to cool down. Again, that critical temperature, 105 to 115. So what I will be doing and finishing in time lapse is melting this butter on the stove just till it gets melted, and then adding in the milk and water itself, which is cold, coming out of the tap water and milk from the fridge, and hopeful that that cold liquid will help cool down this butter, and then I can heat it up to the temperature it needs to be, or I can let it sit longer as it needs to be. But again, 105 to 115, super, super critical. So we'll get that going on the stove. And we are back in real time. Okay, the butter has been melted. It was almost all the way melted before I took it off the stove. Important to do that because the grates on which the pan is sitting are still hot. There's a little small chip of butter in here that hasn't quite melted. That's small enough that'll work itself out in the dough. But when I go to take the temperature of this, I want to get into a deep pool of liquid, especially if you don't have this type of thermometer that has the tip that's able to take a temp right on the tip of the probe. Some of the other temperature thermometers that you use actually have to come quite a bit up to the dimple. So I'm at the 126, 128 stage, so I am going to have to let this cool down a little bit. Okay, so again, the yeast need flour, sugar and moisture and warmth to feed. There is going to be sugar in the milk in the form of lactose and in the butter as well. The moisture obviously is coming from the water and the milk, but to make extra sure that our sponge is being fed, we are going to add in a tablespoon of sugar. That will also help cool this down some. A tablespoon of sugar, which will make sure that this yeast has the sweetness it needs, the sugar it needs to feed. Now we're down to 128, and we're going to be finishing this on time lapse, letting this cool down. Spread out as thin as this is, it's going to cool down faster. I don't have but about 10 degrees to go. If it was quite a bit hotter than that, I might be thinking about putting this into a measuring cup and putting that in the freezer, keeping in mind that if it cooled down too much, then I got to put it back on the stove. All right, the key is to plan ahead, have your butter pre-softened, if not melted, and then you can heat it slowly on the stove. As far as melting the butter, one thing that might come to mind as a possibility from you is to have put that in the microwave. I'm not a huge fan of butter going into the microwave for the fact that when butter melts, there's fat in the butter that floats, there's water in the butter that sinks to the bottom. When the water boils up from the heat in the microwave, it tends to splatter everything all over the place. So again, this is our sponge. It needs to cool down, 105, 115, going to happen in time lapse. Not going to put the yeast in yet till we get to that critical temperature. And we're back in real time. All right, it may not have shown on time lapse, but to help my mixture cool down some, I transferred it from the saucepan, which was still holding a lot of the heat, back into the measuring cup that I used to measure out the water and the milk originally, and just doing that helped bring the temperature down 10 degrees. When we check on this to see if we're in our 105 to 115 range, we're in the 113s, 114s, slowly climbing. Maybe 115 and a half, we're going to be okay. There's a few degrees of wiggle room. We want 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast going in. This dish was a little bit wet inside, so some of the yeast stuck, but that's going to be okay. This is now feeding our sponge. I want to mix this in. Okay, there might be a bubble or two just from me whisking this up. However, if we did the sponge correctly, within 10 minutes, usually less, we will see bubbles forming up of carbon dioxide forming. That will give me the idea that my sponge has been activated and that we're good to go. If after 10 minutes you don't see bubbles coming up, and keep an eye on it because it will bubble up over the top in this smaller container, then you need to start over. If it doesn't bubble up, your mixture of liquid was too hot and it killed the yeast, not warm enough, it didn't wake them up, or you have some old inactive yeast. We'll finish this in time lapse. And we are back in real time. It's been probably 5 to 6 minutes that we have let this grow. We definitely have a lot of bubbles on top, like a head of root beer, say. And our sponge is activated. We're good. So the recipe says that we are going to be mixing together 2 cups of flour, which you might as well just go straight into the KitchenAid bowl. Okay, your 1/4 cup of sugar, your salt and anise for flavoring, not the other 3/4 cup of flour yet. We can go ahead and turn that on low just to make sure that the dry gets mixed together. And then our sponge will get poured in. That has the yeast, the milk, the water, a little bit more sugar, and butter. This gets mixed together. Start coming together as a dough. When that has mixed together, there's still some dry to get incorporated. That's going to be helped along by the addition of 2 eggs. Kind of like the idea of cracking eggs into a dish like this. I get a better chance of seeing whether or not I broke a shell. Now this will get mixed up to incorporate. Now this is definitely mixed together into a dough. It's a very, very wet dough, but there is an element within flour known as gluten that is a stretchy protein that will help this dough to be able to be stretched out, to hold its shape once it rises in the oven from the yeast and also the moisture that turns into steam. So we want to develop that gluten a bit, okay, and we can do that with the aid of the machine. We could mix this by hand, which would be a lot of manual labor, but the machine will also be able to do that. So in time lapse, we can put this on medium to medium high and go for a few minutes to let the machine do the work. We will then be working on adding the rest of the flour later on. But it's easier to get that gluten developed when the dough is a little bit more wet. And we're back in real time. We're going to turn this down on low. be working on incorporating some of our flour on low, go up to medium. So it starts to incorporate, back down to low, especially if it's coming out the top. On low, working a little bit more of the flour, mixing it up a little bit more. It starts to come off the sides a little bit, still holding its mass in the center. Up to high a little bit more so it can come together as a ball. Still on medium, say. Back down to low, a little bit more of the flour. This might be the last amount that I can add with the machine. At any point you could have pulled this dough out and finished it by working the flour in by hand, but I like to let the machine do the work. Okay, that's probably about as much as we're going to get. Now we still have this much more flour, and that does need to be incorporated. And you are always going to have to get your hands dirty a little bit, as it were, covered with flour. But we can go ahead, and that's easy to take off the hook, as you can see. This dough is still fairly wet, so with flour on my hands, it's easier for me to pull it out into one massive ball without it sticking everywhere. Okay, and we want a dough that's a little bit more wet than too dry. Okay, so we want to make sure that we don't add too much flour all at once. It's a texture thing and a feel thing that what we're looking for is for this to threaten to stick. So when I grab this up like, say, a ball that I want to drop, it doesn't want to drop, it wants to stick to my fingers. That is still too wet. So I'm going to work in the rest of this dough. And the kneading motion is folding it over flat onto itself. And from the middle, sometimes you can blot up the excess flour and fold that into itself in the middle. And that will help to make sure it's getting incorporated. So there may be flour left that we're not going to use. It looks like a couple tablespoons. Alright, so we could knead this for a little bit more. Just maybe a bit more on the outside. And we'll see if this threatens to stick. So it still feels a little tacky, but when I hold it, it does release. Maybe a little bit sticks to my fingers. So maybe that last little bit is what we need. You got to knead this on the counter for a couple minutes just to help it finish developing that gluten. Stretchy protein, the gluten will help bring a shine to this. It'll have a bit of a sheen. It may not be so noticeable with the anise seeds and all, and the yolks, the yellowness, but definitely pizza dough, white, you can see that shine. All right, threaten to stick, yes. Okay, so this dough now has to have a chance to rise. Okay, for an hour, hour and a half, and that means it's going to go into a greased bowl, which is just a bowl that we spray. Okay, you can turn the dough so it gets coated. It's greased so it doesn't cling to the sides, it can slide down. We'll cover that with saran wrap and put it somewhere kind of warm to help it rise. You have this mess to clean up. You have your hands to clean up. I often find that just a little bit of flour on the hands kind of helps that all roll off. You eventually got to wash your hands, but a little bit of flour can help you get the dough off your fingers. You're going to scrape this countertop off with your bench scraper anyways. But if your hand's all covered in dough, you're going to get dough on the faucet, the tools, everything else you touch. All right, we're going to be cleaning up off camera, but this is our dough that's ready to rise. Saran wrap, hour, hour and a half in a warm place.